All right, bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue. Welcome online and in person to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for this live podcast recording of the Iron Ring with Women in Engineering. Before passing it over to our hosts and their special guests today, I just wanted to let you know that we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who are the caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on today, for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize and exchange knowledge by co-creating daily activities, conversations, workshops, panels. So we're so pleased to have the opportunity to welcome back Women in Engineering here again for this podcast recording. I'll pass it over now to you, Emily and Amelia.
Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Iron Ring. I'm your host, Emily.
And I'm Amelia.
Today we're joined by Taillant, who's a climate change activist and the current executive director of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, also known as the CEC. So thank you for being with us today. So you've been an advocate for environmental justice for years, from founding the Center for Human Rights and Environment, working for the Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development, and now you're working for the CEC. Why did you choose to enter this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we were chatting about it a little bit with Amelia right before the show. And I must say the field really found me. It wasn't something that I had chosen. It wasn't the pathway that I thought I would lead. In my early years as a teenager, I was going to be a soccer player. That was my passion.
Wow.
And different moments in life and different pathways took me in different directions. And all of a sudden I found myself at university. I was at UC Berkeley in California, where I did my undergraduate work in political science, which was also a field that I hadn't chosen. I just kind of fell into it. I fell into it. And the next thing you know, I was on the East Coast of the United States doing a master's degree again in political economics. And that started taking me in a certain direction. And one thing after another, I started falling into environmental issues.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Was there a specific circumstance that really made you want to continue into this field? Something that really maybe triggered you that you said, I want to work on this and continue on?
There was a woman actually
that
had a lot to do with it. My wife, at the time, we had just met. She was a human rights lawyer and activist, and she started looking into environmental issues as part of her focus in her career. And I was the problem solver, and we were chatting a little earlier.
The engineers.
Yeah, we were chatting with you about what engineering is, and it struck me that the first thing you said was solving problems.
Mm.
And I feel like my life every day is about solving problems. And in this case, it's climate change and environmental contamination, and it's species conservation, and it's looking at marine areas and how do we protect them. And it's about problems. It's about problems about how we've decided to do things, right? And so anyway, going back to the story of how I fell into the field, my wife had started, back then she was my girlfriend, we were engaged, but she had started looking into the relationship between human rights and the environment, which back then, this is the 1990s, wasn't that clear as it is today that human rights and environmental issues went together.
Yeah, which is crazy to think because it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, that's
Yeah.
right. I remember we had a meeting once at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. So this is like the UN of Latin America, right? And they had a human rights unit, that's the Commission on Human Rights, that was on the 8th floor of the building. And the Sustainable Development folks, they were on the 5th floor. So you think, 8th floor, 5th floor,
Yeah.
they might meet every once in a while,
But
actually no. So we helped convene a meeting on the 8th floor.
Brought everyone up.
Of the human rights people and the environment people. And for most of those environment people on the 5th floor, it was the first time they ever pressed the number 8 on the elevator pad to go up to the 8th floor.
Wow.
So, I mean, that must have been a nice change for, to kind of bring people who haven't worked together at all, bring them all together at once. How was that experience with them? Was it?
So that was interesting because as the issues that were on the table, things like health and disease and environmental pollution and human rights, and all of a sudden there was a person talking about human rights to health. That was people on the 8th floor, and how important it was that people not get sick because of mosquitoes. And the guy on the 5th floor says, "Oh, wait a minute, we're working on, dengue and mosquitoes and how changing environments are causing these diseases. So that issue is something I can work on." That was the environment guy on the 5th floor. And the person on the 8th floor saying, we can work on this as a human rights issue. So all of a sudden, going back to problem solving, we had a problem, which was diseases. We had a problem, which was environmental pollution. And these things come together in a discussion on human rights and environment. And so sometimes rethinking how you order things and how you approach problems. I think it was Einstein that said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Yeah.
So we needed to change up the way things were ordered and organized to solve the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's what you were saying, that a lot of people don't realize that there's a huge link between obviously your environment, where you're living, plus the health aspect that comes from that. So when you're in a community that maybe doesn't have a lot of resources towards, clean water, stuff like that, that is directly related to the environmental issues too. And then in turn goes to health and everything. So it's really a full circle, but it's shocking that it's like in that time of, like, it's in the late, 1990s, that it's still something that was not being talked about as much. So it's interesting that it was still very, very recent.
No, it was very recent. And back to the issue of problems and identifying them and solving them, we really had to think outside the box and figure out, why was it that we were having these problems in the way that we were having them? What needed to change in the way we were ordering the elements to get a different result? And that requires taking a step back and looking at what's going on, identifying the problem, but also understanding what the dynamics are of the reasons why you have those problems, and how then can you change them.
Yeah, okay. So then with that being said, what do you think is the biggest problem causing these types of environmental issues? I guess maybe back then versus now, was there a very big difference, or is it still the same problem that's been going around at least for all these years?
Yeah, well, I think we have to rethink how we live. What are the decisions we make, and what are the consequences of those decisions? And before, we thought of natural resources as infinite. No one really thought that we would run out of things, that we would run out of the atmosphere.
I guess because the population was smaller too, right? So it didn't seem like such a
The
big
population
issue
was
at
a
the
lot
time.
smaller. Now we have 20 times more people than we did, or more, 500 years ago. And I just mentioned the atmosphere. We don't think of the atmosphere as finite. And yet, if you think of it like a pie, there's only so much atmosphere, healthy atmosphere. And if we're destroying the atmosphere by polluting it, that means we're running out of atmosphere, right? We're running out of clean air. And what happens when we run out of clean air? It's not only that we get sick, because we need air to live, just like we need water to live.
Of course.
But all of a sudden, our ecosystems are deteriorating, right? And so what are the decisions that we are making to create an impact on the atmosphere, to the point where we no longer have enough healthy atmosphere to do what we need to do and to sustain our lives?
And so which industry do you think is causing the most damage to our atmosphere?
Yeah, that we know what the main industries are.
Yeah.
Right now, we understand that the way we power ourselves needs to change. So we've depended on fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels. So this is a problem.
And the extraction process is really bad too.
But the emissions of gases into the atmosphere is a big part of the problem. And it's not only CO2. This is one issue we need to realize. We talk a lot about decarbonization as the solution to climate change, right? But the reality is, we can get rid of all CO2 emissions right now, everything. Imagine it's all gone today. You have a magic wand, and we clean it up. We have no more CO2 emissions. That doesn't solve our problem.
No.
It doesn't. And it doesn't because once you emit CO2 into the atmosphere, it stays there. And it stays there for hundreds to thousands of years.
God, okay.
So stop emitting CO2, great, but that doesn't solve our problem. And not only that, it keeps warming, because that CO2 that's in the atmosphere keeps warming the planet. Yeah. And so then the question is, what does that mean? I mean, if we just stopped emitting, Do we stop global warming? Well, we don't.
No.
It's going to be there and continue for hundreds of years. And the reality is we're crossing tipping points.
Okay.
And those tipping points, so if I take that vase over there that's made of glass and I let it go, and once I let it go, it's going to hit the ground and break.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do here
No.
to stop that. I can try, but I'm not going to be able to do it. And it's going to break and it's going to spill and it's going to wet everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's irreversible at that point.
Yeah.
And these tipping points, like glaciers melting, for example.
Sorry, I know you wrote a book called Meltdown.
Yes.
So like you were saying, would it be possible to reverse the damage that's been done to like the Arctic
Right.
and the glaciers?
And so that's where I'm going with this idea, which is those irreversible tipping points, by definition, cannot be fixed in our time frame. So ice ages, for example, take about 100,000 years to go through their cycle. If we stop global warming right now, we don't get the ice back for another 100,000 years. And so what does that mean for how we solve the problem? And there's not just one tipping point. Glaciers are one of them, but the forest dieback. There are a lot of things that can get out of sync that become irreversible. And if that's the case, and those things are very close in time, they can start happening in the next 2 or 3 years, in the next 5 or 10 years, then stopping CO2 emissions is not the answer.
Okay.
It's part of the answer, but there are other gases that get us to a better place faster.
Okay.
And is it possible to remove that CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, or
That's a great question.
are you working on like technology? Like, is there technology?
And so we depend on you guys, the engineers, to help us figure this out, right?
Of course.
So I'm going to get to that in a second.
Okay.
But the other gases I wanted to mention that do help us move quicker. Now, this doesn't mean we don't do CO2 emissions reduction.
Yeah.
We have to do that, but that's a long-term solution. It doesn't help us avoid the tipping points in the next few years.
Because it's still there.
Methane gas, natural gas, it's 86 times more potent than CO2 as a climate forcer. That means that, if you had let's say a bottle of CO2 gas that you've stopped emitting, a single bottle of methane gas is about 80 bottles of CO2 gas.
Oh God, okay.
So just by stopping the emissions of one bottle of,
you're already doing a lot more.
you're doing a lot more than you would do with CO2. So methane is one of them, and we have methane in many sources. It's in fossil fuel energy, it's in coal, it's a byproduct of a lot of the oil production.
Isn't also like frozen under? That's one thing that I remember. I met back in like when I remember in high school when we were talking about environmental sciences. That's the first thing they started talking about. That it's not just CO2, but also under. I think it's permafrost.
Exactly. So we have methane in permafrost, which is frozen grounds. We have it in waste. So if all the waste that you throw away at home, like you take your remains of your chicken or your vegetables or your salad and you throw it in the garbage, if it goes to the landfill in the city and it's not treated properly, it becomes methane gas.
Oh God, okay.
And that's coming from your waste. It's also in agriculture.
Yeah, I know flatulence from like cows.
That's exactly
is a
right.
big one. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
And agricultural waste. So all of these sources are contributing to methane emissions. We also have it in wetlands.
Okay.
We also have it in forests. We also have it in permafrost. And so any rotting organic material, whether it's a forest or a wetland or permafrost that's being released because this is trapped organic matter that's frozen and has been for thousands of years because of global warming in the Arctic, which, by the way, is happening 4 times faster than everywhere else. So the Arctic is melting really quick.
Yeah.
If we release all that, it's like a methane bomb.
That's terrible. It's like all at once too.
terrible,
So you can't really do anything about that.
So methane was the first gas. Second is HFCs. That's refrigerants. It's in your car, it's in your home, it's in the supermarket, in the storage areas of cold foods, it's in warehouses that have to store cold foods that you need to get to your meat or your vegetables that are coming to your home. It's in trucks that transports the food. So HFCs are very potent. They can be thousands of times more potent than CO2.
Okay. So that's
another gas.
Yeah,
we got to
that's not
reduce
methane,
those.
that's
That's
now
not
a
even
new one.
methane. It's
Wow,
even
okay.
worse, right?
It's
And then-
hydrofluorocarbons, right?
Hydrofluorocarbons, exactly.
Okay.
And then there's black carbon. Black
Okay.
carbon is soot, basically. So when you see a truck going down the street or some other diesel-powered vehicle, and you see black smoke coming
Oh
out,
yeah,
that's bad.
it's really
Not
often
good.
too. You kind of see that all the time,
gross.
especially on like highways with all the trucks following one after another. I feel like I've
Yeah.
seen that a lot.
So black carbon, once it gets into the atmosphere and it gets into the airstreams and it starts going around the world, when it gets deposited on glaciers or sea ice, it darkens it. And if you've been in really hot weather and you wore a dark shirt, it gets you even hotter. Well, the same thing happens to glaciers.
Okay.
And so black carbon deposited on glaciers, or for example, when there's a forest fire, of which there have been many.
A lot, especially in the in like California, those areas as well.
Yeah, exactly. When that gets into the airstream and it gets deposited on glaciers, it accelerates glacier melt. And then not only that, but black carbon is terrible for human health. So if you're breathing that stuff, not good for you. But that's another gas that is very potent. And by reducing black carbon emissions, we improve human health, but we also reduce the impacts to glaciers due to darkening.
So I was going to ask then, I know there's been a lot of situations also in the US happening, like what happened in Ohio with the train and all of the spillage that happened, and there was a lot of it going into the air. So even at that, if it's coming out of, I believe it was Ohio, that can all go all the way to the glaciers, all of that impact afterwards with all the chemicals.
No, absolutely. I remember like sometimes you have these volcanic eruptions in certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
I remember volcanic eruptions that were occurring in the Andes in South America. We're closing airports in New Zealand.
Wow. Okay.
Because it gets into the airstream and it really goes around the world.
Yeah.
In fact, there are scientists that study the origins or that study geological time and use evidence from volcanic eruptions that occurred thousands and thousands of years ago, and they could find it distributed around the world.
So then even the forest fires happening across the US, even they can impact us just as much as they impact over there.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of things happening at once, and we need to rethink our problem. Going back to the question, what do we do about climate change? If these tipping points are so close, if they're going to occur in the next couple of years or 10 years, then we need to move quickly. And if you think about, you may have heard the Paris Agreement. We talked about the Paris Agreement, which was an agreement of countries around the world to tackle climate change. Say, hey, we've got a serious problem here that we have to figure out. We've got to solve this. And they put a marker in the sand. That marker was 1.5 degrees. And what that marker means is since pre-industrial time, since before we started introducing new technologies like the automobile or industries, we started warming the planet. And the average global temperature started to go up.
Oh God, yeah.
And what scientists have come to understand is that once you surpass 1.5 degrees, these ecosystem collapses, irreversible collapses start occurring. And this is what we want to avoid. So 1.5 degrees is a marker in the sand that is telling us, be careful, if you pass this limit, things are going to get really bad.
And what's the degree that it's increased by on average globally?
So going back to the model, if 1.5 is the marker in the sand, we've already warmed 1.1, 1.2.
Oh God, so we're really not far.
We're close.
Yeah.
We're like 0.3 away.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. We said CO2 isn't helping us. Why? Because if we eliminated all CO2, we keep warming and we surpass 1.5 the next. Some people are saying we're already there.
I've heard that.
And this is not a linear thing, so we can go up and down.
Of course.
But the trend is going up. And so CO2 doesn't stop our breaching 1.5. I mentioned these three gases. The fourth is O3, which is a mix of gases. But anyway, the three that I mentioned, methane, HFCs, and black carbon, if we reduce them intensely in the next 8 to 10 years, together they avoid 0.6 of warming.
Okay.
That's a big difference.
Do your math.
Yeah.
Simple math.
Yeah,
If we're at 1.2, we don't want to get to 1.5, and you get 0.6 in the right direction. or
Yeah.
at least not advancing, right?
Yeah, and then from once you tackle that, you can go into what's already there. So the CO2 that's in the air, how to solve that issue. But like you said, if you stop that, that won't change what already
I can
happened.
see you're a good engineering students
Yeah.
because you're like, you're going with
catching
this.
on.
You got the problem, you understood the solution, and now we got to figure out how to get
Yeah.
there. So point 6 of avoided warming is important. We can get into a few other things that I think you'll get right away. And hopefully that's something you guys and your public and your engineering public can think about for their own careers. But point 6 of avoided warming is huge.
Yeah.
And so we need strategies that help us avoid continuing to warm.
Yeah.
And then you said something really important, which is, can we pull out that CO2?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I would also ask, can we pull out the methane? Because what if we could pull out methane? at
Yeah.
Well,
86
that'd be-
times? That would be awesome,
That'd be
right?
really cool. Yeah.
So we don't, we have some technologies that can do that,
Yeah.
but they're not scalable.
Okay.
We haven't figured out yet how to make it work.
Mhm.
So maybe that's one challenge for you guys
Yeah.
as engineers. You know, how do we pull out that CO2 that's already out there and the methane? Now the CO2 will be there hundreds to thousands of years. Methane has a short lifespan. It only remains in the atmosphere about 10 years.
I wanted to say, I've heard of like carbon capture,
Right.
and then they bury it below ground, but like that lasts there forever, right?
Pretty much.
Underground.
But wouldn't that still affect the ecosystem anyways of the soil that's there, whatever's living on that?
We have ways to deal with that. And,
Okay.
and you know, if the planet's burning up and we're all going to die, it's better to
Trap
fix
it.
the problem and figure out how to deal with that later. But the storage of the carbon is not the problem here. The
Mhm.
problem is, how do we do this at scale in a way that we can, you know, what do you do? Like put a big machine up to suck
Yeah.
up oxygen? It
People-
sounds a little crazy, but
feel like
you know,
people
that's kind of
always
the
say-
challenge that we
People always say, I feel like, just plant all the trees. Trees, they with the everyone. That's the one thing I've heard for years. For some reason, it's like the solution is like, obviously deforestation is a huge problem, but I feel like if you're just only planting trees, it won't do enough to actually trap all of the CO2 and whatnot, because there's still so much
Yeah.
that's already in the atmosphere.
But we've learned something just right here in this conversation, which is we don't have time. So how long does a
True, a
tree
tree
take to grow?
That's a good point.
You know,
Yeah.
so we need solutions that are quick. You know, we
Okay.
can't wait around 20 years for a tree to mature to capture all that CO2.
Yeah.
So that's a problem.
So then, based on your, experience, I know you've worked with, international organizations, you've worked at the UN, the World Bank. Based off of that, do you think that they're putting enough pressure on, obviously, maybe the big companies that are at fault, at least for the majority amount of, pollutions and emissions? Do you think we're doing enough from at least the government ends?
Yeah, and that's a part of the discussion.
Hmm.
I don't think there's a single culprit here that's at fault, and if we fix that, the problem's over. We all,
we're all-
need-
yeah.
this is an all of society problem that has to be tackled by all of society. So our consumption patterns, the way we do
Yeah.
things, the choices we make. You're gonna buy a new stove. The moment you buy a big appliance or you buy a car, these are things you have for a long time.
Mhm.
If you make a good choice, your long-term impact is much lower.
Yeah.
Right. But there was one thing we haven't talked about, which are nature-based solutions, which is
Okay.
another dimension here, right?
Yeah.
So let me give you some examples. We were talking about heat, when it gets really hot.
Mhm.
We see that places are getting unlivably hot,
Mhm.
right? And let's say it's 100, let's go Fahrenheit, it's 100 degrees outside, right? And you're in a city and there are no trees, it's just cement. And on top of that roof of that building, there's black tar. Well, you know what? Black absorbs heat. It's not 100 on the roof, it's 140.
Yeah.
You can't even be up there, it's so hot.
No.
All right, now what if on that top floor, let's say it's the 4th floor, it's in a low-income neighborhood, they have no AC.
Mm.
It's an oven in there.
Yeah.
So that's a health problem. People are suffering respiratory diseases and other heat stroke related diseases,
Yeah.
right? If it's a poor income neighborhood and the folks that live on that 4th floor, because it's not a nice place to live, they're paying cheap rent, they have no AC. If they have to put in AC, they're probably getting bad AC. And if
Yeah.
the landlord hasn't modernized their AC, let's go back to the HFCs, which refrigerate those ACs.
Oh God.
What if they're using the worst refrigerant that's 4,000 times worse than CO2?
It's a cheaper alternative a lot of the time to do those things.
So if we could, let's do a few things. Let's paint the roof white.
Or put a green roof.
Put a green roof.
And
How
then
about
it's
some
like
trees?
natural climatization
How
of
about
air
some
in the building.
shade?
Yeah.
There are cities, and this we get into a whole nother discussion about environmental equity and climate justice and environmental justice. There are cities that you can look at the city and look at where the wealthy people live, look at where the poor people live, and then look at where the trees are. Guess what? Guess where they are? They're in the richer neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So when it's 100 degrees out, it's 80 there.
It's on the
So
other
sad.
end.
Because they're
it's terrible.
sad, because there's shade.
Yeah.
And in the poorer neighborhoods, there are no trees. Well, that was actually who planted trees? Well, it could have been the city government. So there's historical discrimination happening
Wow.
in the way in which we spend our monies and the way it's distributed.
It's prioritized towards people in wealthier neighborhoods.
So this is
and
what we call environmental injustice.
Yeah.
And this is one of the new priorities of governments around the world today, realizing that decisions that were made, and there are probably engineers working for the city that could help with those decisions in terms of how we distribute our natural resources to create shade or to put a garden on a roof.
It's almost like simple solutions that could be done. It's just they're not taking the time.
So let's go back
do
to that example of the 4-story building in the city. Let's say we did put a garden on the roof, and let's say we got some trees that have leaves in the summer and no leaves in the winter, so that the building can heat up when it needs to heat up, and it can cool down when it needs to cool down. And we put in new AC, which is more efficient. And we put in less contaminating refrigerants. So all of a sudden, we've cooled the city, because if you do that in all the buildings, it's not as hot downtown,
Yeah.
right? So we can drop 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees downtown, which can mean a lot when the temperature is getting really hot.
Yeah, of course.
And if you look at what's happening on the west coast of North America when it's getting so hot, the materials the engineers chose years ago are no longer sustaining the heat. They're melting. And so anyway, we can all of a sudden cool the city, increase or improve the health of the community, especially those that need it most. We can lower energy bills. We can use less AC. And then we're reducing one of those 4 gases we talked about. We can do that pretty quickly, low-cost solutions. Everyone is benefited. And not only that, but the city, if the streets are too hot, the cement doesn't last as long. It breaks up.
Yeah.
These are problems that the city could tackle by planting trees. I've heard cities say, "Oh, we don't plant trees because we can't pay for watering them. We only have a couple of people in our parks and recs departments, and the problem is we can't maintain it." Like, well, did you think about all the money you'd save by your streets not breaking up because of the heat?
Oh my God, the roads here are terrible
It's a fraction
too.
of what you spend on watering the trees.
Yeah,
And
wow.
that's because people are not rethinking the problems. It goes, I mean, it's a similar example to what we talked about in the human rights and environment people in the OAS.
Yeah.
You need to change up a little bit the way you do things and rethink your problem from a different angle.
Yeah, so basically I feel like a good thing about our generation is that we're very much trying to put a new perspective on a lot of things. And I feel like, not to say that, the older generations are not open to these changes, but a lot of them are also not open to the changes. I feel like they're set in their ways, or again, the costs is one big major thing with a lot of companies as well, that, I think investing right away might be sometimes a pricier beginning, but then afterwards it ends up being, more profitable in the end. You're not putting in all these investments into reparations, all these things in the end. So to me, I find it's very strange that some companies don't, invest in these like greener solutions and these ideas without realizing that it's going to actually be good and beneficial in the long run. I mean, for me, it doesn't make sense.
I was gonna say the same thing. It's like they don't want to spend the money
Right
like presently, but like they can't see the future almost. I feel like older generations have a hard time with like envisioning the future.
I don't know if that's
good segue into the youth discussion.
Yeah.
Let's talk about
Yes.
that.
No,
because
of course.
it's a generational thing. Yes, it is, but it's a human nature thing too. People are reluctant to change.
Yeah.
It's like when you have your hamburger, how do you put ketchup, or do you put mustard, or you put
You set in
mayonnaise?
your habits.
You always do it the same.
Of course.
And someone comes in with a new sauce, says,
Like,
put this on, you're like, no.
I don't want that.
So that's human nature. right?
Mhm.
But let's go to the youth discussion, because I think this is interesting. So something happened during COVID that I want to talk about, because
Okay.
I focused on this a little bit and actually wrote a paper about this. It's one of the chapters in this book you mentioned, Meltdown, that I wrote with a McGill student, actually. So at the time I was 50, she was 20. So there was this huge generational gap, and we
Yeah.
wrote this paper together. And the paper was about comparing COVID and climate change, and how governments have reacted to each, and how we quickly mobilized to address COVID and haven't done so much for climate. And we discussed several things there. But so here's an important point. During COVID, we did something that was unimaginable before. We stopped the world. Stopped everything. We stopped trucks and airplanes and ships. People didn't go outside. They didn't go to work.
Curfews.
We turned off the world. And by doing that, we turned off emissions. I mean, not completely, but
enough,
a lot of them.
enough to see the
yes,
difference.
A lot of those black carbon emissions, they disappeared. And what happened in places like India and Pakistan? All of a sudden, people living near the Andes could see the Andes, not the Andes, the Himalayas, could see the mountains.
Wow.
This was in the news, where this little town that was, 50, 60 miles away from the Himalayas had never seen the Himalayas.
Wow.
There was so much black carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And within 2 weeks, they were gone. We saw mountains.
That's crazy.
That is crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And if we dial back a little bit, I remember dinner table conversations with my kids saying, what do we need to stop climate change? And I was saying things like, well, we have to stop industry and stop the planes and stop the trucks, and that's never going to happen.
Yeah, no.
And so it's so frustrating that we don't just stop the way we do things. Well, we did it, and we saw immediate benefits.
Literally.
So here's the youth and generational thing. My generation has the baggage of failure on climate. We've learned that we've screwed things up.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of things that have been done in the past.
Exactly. And we're frustrated, and we can't imagine a world that is different. Whereas youth saw that in 2 weeks, we fixed the problem. I mean, we didn't fix climate change, but
It could have been
we
fixed.
changed the world in 2 weeks. And so youth does not have that baggage of failure. And particularly for people like you guys that solve problems, you can think out of the box much more easily, because you don't have that history of failed attempts.
Yeah.
Right? You just saw that when we have to, we can do it. And that to me is inspiring. And I think the freshness of youth in this discussion is extremely important.
There's one thing that I've noticed, though, I think with our generation, that there is a lot of course, people that are very, pushy and hopeful, and they want to do a lot of things. But then I also have heard a lot of the other end of people being like there's what's the point anymore? Or, a lot of them don't think that their impact, individually will actually have an impact on everything else. And that's a conversation I've had with a lot of people, where they're like, well, if I don't recycle, then it's just one person, it's not gonna make a difference. But it's like, if everyone has that mindset, it's gonna be terrible all around the world, doing your own part is a big thing. But that's another thing where I find a lot of youth are either not in denial about it, but they're like, I don't see the point, we're already here. Whereas the other people are like, but no, like you said, we saw how things can easily be changed, and governments, they put a stop to something, and look at what happened. There was, like you said, clear evidence that things cleared up, and clear evidence that it worked. So I don't know, I feel like there's some people who don't always agree with this, but I find that I think still a majority of us do, and we want to make the difference. But
I think there's theories that individually we don't have a huge impact on the environment. So people just assume, okay, I'm not going to recycle, like you said, or I'm not going to compost.
Yeah.
Because it's really the big industries that are making the biggest impact on our environment.
We don't make a difference. We're that 0.001%, but this company who's especially with extracting, all of the fossil fuels, all those things as well, they're very damaging industry. So it's their fault. They got us here. I don't need to do my part. But I don't agree with that at all. And I feel like a lot of youth have that mentality as well. So I don't know how to almost convince them otherwise. Is there anything that we can tell them to say that your impact really actually has a difference?
Well, again, I want to stay away from the idea that there are companies that are the problem, right? Companies are made of people, made of individuals.
Yeah.
They don't
That's a
think
really good
by
point.
themselves. It's
Yeah.
not AI running the oil industry. It's people. So people do make a difference. And in certain parts of society, that's clear. You would never say that Lionel Messi is not important as an individual. One person changed the history of football in Argentina.
It grasps a lot of people's attention right now, for sure. People are gonna be like, okay, now I understand this analogy.
Right? So, single people do have influence. You may not think you have influence, but you do. And when you talk to people, when you have a conversation, when, you talk to your mom about the next appliance the family is going to buy and why it should not be natural gas, why it should be a different energy, or the next car you're going to buy. All these decisions are important. And so we do have individual power to change things. And again, it is a all of society problem that we have. So it does need an all of society solution. The more people who believe in that change, the quicker we're going to move towards the change. It's already happening. It's already happening. I was part of a small group of people to try to get methane on the map globally. And 3-4 years ago, it wasn't.
That's not long ago.
No, that's not very long ago.
No.
And that was a handful of people that took that fight forward to get it on the global map to do something about methane emission reductions. And now everyone's talking about it. So a few people can change the direction of things. And we have examples of that throughout history. And so we need to be a little bit more confident that our individual leadership can make a difference, just as individual leadership can make bad decisions too.
Yeah.
I think a big issue is that people don't see the effects of climate change, so they assume that nothing's happening. Kind of going back to like your COVID example, like people were actually getting sick, actually dying, so people are like, okay, I'll wear a mask, I'll clean my hands.
Immediate, you see it.
It's more like the poorer countries that are seeing all of this because we're dumping our garbage there, for example.
Yeah.
Also, I think one thing that I've realized is that people have this weird idea when you talk about, global warming and all these things, where you see right now there's snow in California and people are like, but what, or snow in Texas? There was a huge ice storm, and, obviously the infrastructure in Texas is not meant to sustain those types of weathers, which is why everything shuts down. But people have this idea, well, it's like, global warming doesn't necessarily mean everywhere around the world is going to be very hot, but it also means that the fluctuations in temperature are going to be drastic, right? And people also don't have that idea, or they don't understand that that's another consequence too of what's happening if we don't stop these gases from entering our atmosphere and affecting us. I think it's also a huge thing.
There's a lot of confusion in the terminology.
Yeah.
So we say very loosely global warming, or we say climate change, and people maybe don't quite understand what the difference is. And global warming or climate change doesn't mean it necessarily gets warmer everywhere.
Yeah.
When we talk about global warming, we're talking about an average temperature at the global scale. So we do know that the planet is warming. There's no doubt about this. If you're a denier of this, it simply doesn't sustain itself with the science that we have. The planet is warming. Now that might mean that in certain places, it might get colder, or it might get more snow. Here's something that people understand right away. If you look at the globe, if you have the globe in front of you, not the one you have at school, and you look at Canada and Europe, they're on the same level. It was 40 below here a couple weeks back. It doesn't get to 40 below in Paris.
No.
Why not? We're pretty much at the same level. It's just, have you thought about that?
Not really.
Not really, right?
In that perspective, no.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't think about those things, but there's a reason for that. The reason is because there's a circulation of the ocean currents, circulation of the air currents. And if you look at the map, where you got Canada up here and Paris up here, cold water is coming down from the Arctic. It's going to the equator, it's warming up, and it's coming right back up by Europe. And that warm water helps keep Europe warmer than Canada. they're not ready over there in Europe for an ice age or
no.
at 40 below zero. And if it were 40 below for a long time, they'd have problems.
Yeah.
And what's happening with glacier melt, this is sort of what my book is about, meltdown. As glaciers, which cover a very significant portion of the Earth, melt into the ocean, you've got fresh water disturbing ocean salinity.
Yeah.
And that creates disturbances in the ocean composition, and it disturbs the flow of the currents.
Yep.
And that could stop that that impact can stop the circulation. And if that circulation stops, that warm water is not going to be coming up to Europe anymore.
And then
Europe could go into a deep freeze.
Yeah.
So global warming is happening, but that doesn't mean everywhere necessarily warms at all times. It could be disruption of weather patterns that you need for healthy agriculture. It could mean the disruption of how your winter plays out or how much snow you get.
Yep.
And if you're not ready to get all that snow in a place that is just not equipped for it because it doesn't have the proper heating or the proper construction materials, you're going to have problems.
Yeah.
Whether it's flooding or cold weather or too hot weather.
That too.
Or a hurricane that all of a sudden gets stuck and doesn't move and destroys your area. There are a lot of things that could happen by disturbing the weather patterns. And this is part of climate change.
Everything's basically all linked together.
It's all linked together. This is something we need to understand. What happens, emissions, one of the scientists that I highly respect is a man named Ramanathan, who has helped us understand the impacts of short-lived pollutants, for example. And he stresses, contamination anywhere is contamination everywhere because it's all interlinked.
Yeah. Oh God.
Kind of like microplastics that's like in the water, in our agriculture, in our food. Now it's in our bodies. Yeah. It's kind of the same thing.
No, that's exactly right. And our systems are such now that you're eating raspberries from Mexico or from Chile or from Peru. You go to the store, everything's interlinked. And so whatever we're doing in one place ends up in another place.
Yeah.
And we need to rethink, going back to that first discussion we had, the way that we structure ourselves, how our societies are built and designed. And coming back to you guys, the engineers, you really have a role to play in the future to help society figure out how to deal with this problem. And we don't have a lot of time, so we need people thinking about this.
Gotta go do this right now.
So
Tomorrow is, I still have a year left of my degree, but I'm like, but I need to do this right now. Pretty much, but that's the thing. It's a big thing for a lot of people. I think even for us, like, I know a lot of people have put this in their mind that, they've realized and they've acknowledged that this is something that has to be dealt with now. And it's funny because I know that, like my sister, she was reading this paper about all of the effects of course, like all these extractions and everything. This was back in 2014, and they were warning about what was going to happen. And it's 2014, and we're now literally 2023, and it's like no one has kind of learned from the things that people have written about either. So it's just back in, now the youth is learning about it and hopefully making a difference in that sense. But I guess we're going to have to really hope that our generation is very much, adamant on really trying to make a difference in that sense,
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, the urgency is so important because there's a paradoxical reality here, which is we might do a lot to stop climate change. We might do a lot to try to fix the problem. But if we don't make the right decisions in the amount of time that we have before it's too late, then everything that we do is futile. So we have two options. We either fix the problem and improve our climate and reduce impacts, or we deal with the consequences, which is a whole different way of approaching things, which is sort of throwing in the towel and saying, we're already too screwed up to fix this. Let's just help the people that are most impacted, or let's find better places to live. For a place like Canada, that may mean a lot of immigration because people are moving out of places where it's no longer livable. And as certain places become more livable, you're likely to have to face the reality that people don't have a place to live anymore.
And overpopulation in certain cities is another issue, though. If you have a lot of people move into one big city, then obviously it's just going to be a very vicious circle, I think, in that sense, too. So I feel like it's a good thing with immigration to move around, but also at the same time, if we overpopulate cities that cannot be overpopulated, we might get stuck in the same position, no?
Yeah, and I think again, it's a matter of understanding how we live and how we can improve the way we live. In these times where inflation is such a problem and the cost of living is a problem, the cost of food is a problem, and housing and the price of housing, how we can improve the way that we live so we're spending less on things like energy, so our energy is more efficient, so we don't have to turn on that heating. If you have good windows and good insulation, you may need less heating. You need less heating, that's less emissions. Really important. If we can think better on how we manage our waste. Are you throwing away what you're buying? It's amazing to learn how much food production never makes it to your plate.
Yeah.
It goes almost straight to the landfill or to the garbage. That's terrible. We shouldn't be growing crops to throw them away, because our systems, back to the engineers, our systems are not efficiently delivering the food to our tables. We're basically planting crops to emit methane to contaminate the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not a good solution.
No.
There's a problem with the system.
I think people need more incentive to be more sustainable in general. Like, I know Hydro has like a plan where if you turn off your lights during a certain time of day, you'll get like some reimbursement for your bills. So for example, like stuff like that, I think we need more of that so people can, compost or recycle.
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated challenge to figure out all of the pieces that fit together. So you're talking about incentives that might come from a company, which is great. But maybe the government needs to have incentives for the company, or penalties, carrot and stick, right? If you don't do this, then you get penalized. If you do this, then you have a tax break, for example. So government regulations are critical, but also the consumer. It's human choices. It's a choice of a person that, today I walked out of my home. My home was it's 19 degrees. I walk out and I lower my thermostat because I don't need it to be heating my home right now. I'm here with you guys. There's no one at home.
Yeah.
So I lower it so I'm not
wasting
energy, right?
Yeah.
Do we do that? That's such a simple thing.
It is. I'm sure a lot of people don't even think about that when they leave their house or they do something. They keep the light on when they're not in their room just because they don't think about closing it when they leave, things like that.
So maybe you should design the next thermostat, and they're already out there, but that takes care of that for you.
No, like activity in the
sensor,
room.
that turns.
What if it was just so easy that your thermostat just had an eco switch? You put on eco and it does all of that for you. Figures out.
Yeah.
Maybe you tell Alexa.
Cars.
Hey Alexa, tell if there's no one in the home, turn the thermostat into eco mode. We need to rethink how we organize our households, right?
Yeah. I mean, hopefully that people have that drive to do that, I think.
What are some habits you have?
Yeah, so besides the thermostat, like, is there anything else that you think is people don't think about, but that you do and you realize after a while it's actually super easy to do?
Maybe like inspire some people.
No, that's a great question. I try to do my part. First of all, my work is a big part of that. What I devote my time and energy to. I try to solve problems. I feel like after how you described engineering to me, I feel like I'm an engineer. Maybe I should get an honorary ring at some point. I feel like I'm always trying to solve environmental problems. I think you need to be, in everything you do, you need to be reasonable and think through the consequences of your actions. So I try to be as reasonable and fair as possible with my own convictions when I'm buying something or when I'm choosing to go somewhere. I try to use the bus or I can't now with the big C's. I didn't realize that I just moved to Montreal.
Yeah.
It's my first winter here. I didn't realize you picked up your Bixies and they disappeared as soon as the storm
They
came.
kick them
as
on
soon
a
as the
truck and
cold
they
came.
leave.
Yeah. But I have a Bixie account, and I try to use the Bixie as much as possible. I didn't bring my car.
Oh,
I
wow,
didn't buy a
okay.
car when I came here, so I have no car. In my family, we bought an electric vehicle for my daughter a few years ago, and try to not drive as much or use the electric car for most of our shopping or local stuff.
Mhm.
Again, I don't think there are single things that you need to do. It's more of being aware and thinking about what your impact is, and you see something that you're not happy with. You're at a supermarket, or you're at a cafe, and you see wasteful things. Go up and tell the manager. Be a
Yeah.
little bit more proactive, not just accepting things as they are.
Yeah.
Going back to the hamburger example, that sauce coming in, might try it out. Might be
Be open.
might be good. Be open and challenge yourself in each step of the way.
Honestly, it's a good thought to have, I think. But I guess with that being said, do you think that our generation is going to do that? You think we're going to be more, proactive? I guess it could be like if we have hope for our generation in that sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how you guys will react. One thing I don't like, though, I hear a lot of people say, well, the youth have to solve the problem. And
Yeah.
youth, that's a terrible weight on your
I
shoulders.
hear that a lot.
That's a terrible weight. And the fact is, youth aren't in power yet. Your generation is trying to find a job.
Yeah.
We are the ones with the jobs right now. So I challenge my own generation to not throw this on youth, because we're still in control for the most part. So we have a huge obligation, our generation, to try to set a better course. One thing we can do, I'm talking about my generation, is create that space for youth.
Okay.
So, we'll talk maybe a little bit about the CEC and the work we do, but it's important to get youth at the table and to give youth that space. And so when I wrote this last book, I published this last book, one of the chapters I co-authored with Amelia Murphy, who is a McGill student, and she's off doing other things now, great climate action and activism. But I thought it was important to bring a different point of view into the discussion. And so creating that space for youth is important. And then for youth, you guys are growing up in a different era. You have a lot of options.
Yeah. Very true.
And it's hard, I'm sure it's hard, with so many options that maybe my generation didn't have, to choose wisely.
Yeah.
To set a course, right? I think the first question you asked me is how I ended up in this career. And the challenge really is to set that course and how to set it. And I think it goes back to this last point we talked about, which is being true to the things that are important to you. So it's not so much the job you're going to get. It's more about, are you comfortable and do you like the path you're on? Having so many, it used to be that you got a job and you stayed there for 30 years.
Yeah.
That's so true.
It doesn't happen anymore. Youth don't do that. Youth are they take a job and 2 years later they're gone, or 3 years later they're on to the next one. And that's okay. But then the question is, what is in it for you at the end of the day? Is it the place you work, or is it what you're doing?
Yeah.
And I tend to divide life into maybe 3 moments of the day. A third of your life you spend sleeping.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So have a good bed. Get good pillows.
You think about it like that.
Third of your life you spend at work.
Yeah.
So enjoy what you do.
Yeah.
If your awake time is divided into 2, it's at work or not at work, right? So if you're going to be at work, you better like being at work. So do something you like. Work with people you like to work with. More than the company, think about who you're with and what you're doing.
The environment.
Whatever your job is, it doesn't matter. Do you like it is the question.
Yeah.
And that's going to be important. And the other third, you're with the people you want to be with, whether
course.
it's family or your spouse or your partner or just with friends, people you want to be with. because that's the inspiring part. You don't want to get out of work and then not enjoy who you're with, right? You want to have
Honestly.
fun at work, like what you do, and you want to like the people you're with. And if you've got, those three priorities set, where you sleep, who you hang out with, and where
And
you
what
work,
do, yeah.
then the decision is easier.
Hmm.
And if you're finding you don't like one of those, you need to probably change your path.
I think that's good advice for really anyone.
It's really good life advice.
Yeah, even for people that are our age who always get confused as to where to start. I'm sure that's a good idea to have. Like, where do you see yourself and who do you want to be around is, I think, one of the biggest things. So I think that's a very good, just good piece of advice for a lot of young people. But you did mention though the CEC, so we do want to kind of ask a little bit about that. In your position, you're executive director. For people who don't really know what the CEC does, can you maybe do a little brief
Absolutely.
description?
So you've probably heard of NAFTA, the North American
Yes.
Free Trade Agreement,
Yeah.
right? Maybe not so much for your generation, but
No, I feel like
when
we know a little bit,
the
right?
NAFTA. So this was the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and it was signed in the 1990s. It was a different time back then, but already in the 1990s, the planet understood we had some environmental challenges to face, and so alongside this trade agreement, the three countries also signed an environmental agreement, and they said, you know what, we need to work together to protect our shared environment. And this was pretty novel. It was the first time a trade agreement incorporated this environmental dimension to it. And we were thinking back then, and when I say we, it's the three countries, it's the US, Canada, and Mexico. We were thinking of shared species, of shared wetlands. You've been on Google Earth. That's part of your training, I'm sure. If you go on Google Earth and you remove the borders and you look at just North America as a natural environment, it's all together.
Yeah.
The mountains start up in the Yukon, they shift through the Rockies and then right into Mexico. And there are huge peaks in Mexico, near Mexico City. So when you look at that environment together, you understand it is a single environment and it's interrelated. And the birds don't stop at the border, they don't stop at the wall, they don't stop for immigration, they just go right through. Same with the marine environment and the species that are in the waters, the grasslands, the forests. And so the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, was a space that was created to think about that shared environment, how we could mutually, in between the three countries, protect it. So they decided at the time that there would be a secretariat of technical experts that would come together, and they would be members of the three countries, and they would be the ones, as a secretariat, taking on the responsibilities of putting this to work, of implementing this idea. And the three countries also established the political authorities to do this. And so in the case of the CEC, the political authorities are the environment heads. So in Canada, it's head of Environment Canada. In the United States, it's the head of EPA, Environmental Protection Agencies, and in Mexico, it's the Secretary of Environment. And Canada offered to host the Secretariat. And Montreal was chosen, and they set up the offices right down in the trade building at Square Victoria. Now that we've moved just a few blocks away, but that's where the Secretariat is, and there's a group of about close to 50 people. And that number has changed over the years, but it's the group that does the technical work of protecting our shared environment. So it's a governmental or diplomatic agency.
Okay.
So we are diplomats at the CEC, and we represent the three countries. So our work is in the name of the three countries, and we follow the instruction of the council, which is the ministers of environment. And we've been doing this for about 30 years. I've only been here 6 months. I'm the new executive director.
Okay. And
what projects are you currently working on?
Yeah, so several projects, and those have changed over the years. And some of these elements that I just mentioned, the migratory species, and this can be birds, or it can be mammals, or it can be the butterfly.
It's the symbol of the CEC,
That's a
right?
symbol.
The
That's our
monarch
logo.
butterfly.
Yeah. So the butterfly, I want to stop and chat a little bit about the butterfly, because it's very delicate. but it's very symbolic,
Yeah.
and it gives us a bit of hope, and it has to do with youth, and it has to do with older generations. So the butterfly is a migratory species, and it moves freely between Canada and Mexico, and it actually migrates.
Great.
It starts in Canada and flies down to Mexico and then back. And you might think it's a single butterfly that does that, and actually no. The butterfly does it through multi-generations, and it lives and dies during that migration.
Oh, wow.
No
So
way.
it's an interdependence of youth and the older generation. And when you set out as a butterfly to do that migration, you're not going to be the one making it back. Someone else will.
Wow. It's really beautiful.
And
That
so it's,
is
yeah,
really-
isn't it?
Yeah.
And so it's very delicate, but very strong. And it's intergenerationally dependent. And we need to think of ourselves that way. No single person is, the say all and do all of society. And when you go back, we were talking earlier about the challenges that we have as individuals to change. We need to think about intergenerational relationships. It's not just about us. Indigenous peoples have a different way of looking at human history and natural history. And we tend to think of us and me, and I was born on such and such day, and I will do this, and this is my career, and here's where I live. And Indigenous communities have a different way of looking at these relationships, and they see themselves as part of something bigger. And I think it's so important, and we'll get maybe more into this in a moment, but to again, rethink the problem we have in a different way and understand what our role is in this problem and in our ecosystems, and think of ourselves as multi-generational. What has been left to us? What is our responsibility to steward and protect what we have? And what are we leaving to future generations? And going back to the butterfly, I think it's very symbolic to understand the delicacy, the fragility, but really the importance and the strength of this particular species and how it survives and how it goes about coexisting with its environment.
Wow. I knew it was a symbol, but I didn't realize actually the whole background behind it. It's really nice. But so with the CC, I know you guys do a lot of projects. Is there anything that youth can get involved in, or?
Absolutely.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are working with youth. We want youth to be part of our team, and it is part of our team. I guess one question is, what is youth? That's a first definitional challenge. There's no clear definition of what youth is. Is it someone who's 20? Is it someone who's 25? Or is it someone who's 5? And I think it's a little bit of all of that. We are helping identify youth leaders on climate and on other environmental challenges that we have. And we are helping youth gain visibility and recognizing their work and trying to incorporate youth into everything we do, just as we are incorporating other issues such as Indigenous considerations in our work. But youth, again, is a very important piece of our work, and it has to be part of the solution moving forward.
Yeah.
We offer internships, so I invite all of your listeners to look at our website and consider maybe doing an internship with the CEC or with another organization. The important thing is to follow that pathway and find those things that you're interested in. I think one thing that has changed over the years is the ability to do internships, short internships, so that you can try something out before you fully dive in. So I would highly encourage those that can, maybe that have the means to do it, because many internships are not paid. Some are, of course, but try things out. This is a world in which we live now where you can do this. You can intern sometimes remotely, sometimes in person. You may be able to travel to other parts of the world to intern. All these things nurture your own understanding of what you're doing and what you like and what you don't like, and are opportunities to look at something new or different and find a way. So back to the CC, for us, youth is extremely important, and we are trying to incorporate youth in most of what we do, and look forward to more youth engagement in the coming years.
That's great. No, I think
great.
like I think we've emphasized a lot that youth has a big role to play in general. So I think it's really great that you guys want to encourage youth to come in and do a lot more. We are kind of gonna need to start closing off everything, but basically, is there any type of also, just quickly anything coming up in the next, throughout the summer that maybe anyone can participate, look up on your website, things like that? Is there anything that's coming up specifically that you'd love to kind of
Yeah, there's
advertise?
always something coming up. So a big event that we have coming up probably in June is in British Columbia. We will have our council meeting. This happens once a year. It's the moment where the highest authorities come, so that the three ministers will be present from each of the countries. It's a moment where I don't want to say reset, but it's a reset moment in which we look at what we've been doing, where we've come, and where we want to go. And this is always an important moment in the CC's timeline, because it recharges our batteries, gets the authorities in to discuss with us what we're working on. It's a moment where we can discuss the priorities of our stakeholder groups. We have two important ones at the CC, including the Indigenous and Traditional Ecological Knowledge Group. This is Indigenous communities of 3 countries that come together through their representation at the CC. We just had a meeting of the group in the last few days, and it will be another moment where we come together to discuss Indigenous priorities. We also have a civil society group called the JPAC, the Public Advisory Committee, and that also is representatives from the 3 countries that come together from civil society to provide input into our work. And we do consultations and stakeholder meetings, and we try that our work is incorporating the view of Indigenous communities, of civil society, of youth in this case, and we're exploring other dimensions as well. So it's a good moment in our council meeting in June to rethink where we're at and where we want to go.
Oh, that's great.
Cool.
Yeah, so BC, I'm sure every year it's like a new, like you said, let's see where we're gonna go from now. Let's see what we did. So that's really awesome. I'm glad that there is, at least a trilateral agreement that people are trying to, put emphasis on this, because I think, again, it's one of the major issues of our world right now, our population. We have to kind of worry about this right now. So honestly, again, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
This was a really, really great discussion, and I hope that whoever was listening, maybe has some either new ideas about climate change in general, or will do more from their end to also, maybe help and alleviate some of the kind of consequences we've already had and we have to deal with from now on. So once again, Daniel, thank you. You guys have a website, your social medias, you guys post there very often, right?
Yeah, we do. CEC.org. It's an easy one.
Perfect. CC.org. If anyone wants to go check out their website, if anyone wants to go see, I think you have also Twitter, LinkedIn, all of that. They post a lot of information there. Also for us, Women in Engineering, we're always on our Instagrams, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. So you can find us there. Thank you again to the Fourth Space for allowing us to film this podcast over here. They have a lot of awesome events also coming up. So look at their website. And thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys on the next episode of The Iron Ring.
Amazing. Woo!
Great.
Well, thanks so much once again for coming in person. I'm just going to give a quick shout out to the folks who joined us online. We're a little group here behind the scenes. Thank you for making the time to listen to this conversation live as it was happening. We appreciate your time and being here with us today. We're going to close up the Zoom now in the stream and invite you back next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Ciao.